The Golf GTI is one of those motoring icons that more or less defines the category in which it resides. Along with the Mazda MX-5, the BMW M3 and the Porsche 911, it has always been a benchmark car. And yet, now I come to think about it, I'm not really sure why. It's often credited with inventing the hot hatch segment, but it didn't actually do that. Yet the Mark 1 GTI, I can see why people loved it. It wasn't the first, but it was certainly the car that made the formula work. In much the same way that Apple did not invent the tablet, but they made it work. They made people want one. They gave people a reason to use it. However, even those I know who really love their Golfs will admit that the Mark III and 4 were not great. The Mark V was a fabulous return to form, and to this day I still recommend it as an excellent car to purchase if you want something fun and practical on a limited budget. However, in the intervening years we've seen 2.5 generations of car come and go, yet they didn't really feel distinctly different to the Mark V. In fact, with the introduction of the Mark 7R in all-wheel drive, the GTI more or less became obsolete. After all, you could have it for only another 3 Grotniks a month on your finance deal, so what was the point in the GTI? But now there is a new Golf, the Mark 8, and with it, a new GTI. To understand whether this car is worthy of the name, we have to really think about what a Golf GTI actually is. It's rarely ever been the fastest car in the segment. It's certainly never been the cheapest, but it has always been that jack of all trades, that one car that is all things to all people. And it's been a sort of sensible beacon in an age of crazily styled things like the Honda Civic Type R. With a hot hatch, you have to imagine this is probably going to be the buyer's only car, so it's very important that it is both practical and fun in equal measure. So how does this car stack up? Well, I'm afraid it's not good. This engine, 2-litre turbocharged, pretty much the same as before, puts out only 245 horsepower, a figure so measly, so insignificant in today's marketplace, you won't even find a VW badge on it. They must be embarrassed. And how much do they want for this car? With its incredibly heavy steel bonnet, £42,500. So it must be filled with luxury features, right? How about soft closed doors? No. Double glazing? Also no. Electric folding tailgate? No. Premium tyres? Nope, that's a Hankook. How about this new all-digital interior then? Well, it's a disaster. The old Mark 7.5 wasn't really that different from the Mark V. It was pretty plain, but it did the job. This has an all-new setup, and it's easily one of my least favourite interiors of all time. It's absolutely tragic. First off, you have these touch-sensitive buttons on the steering wheel, much like in the VW Arteon I tested recently. And just like in that car, you've got no idea what button it is that you're pressing unless you're looking at it, which means it's both ergonomically poor and dangerous. This screen here is actually okay, and you can configure it reasonably. You can bring up lots of different information, but this screen in the middle here seems to have been styled rather than designed or thought through. And who came up with the idea of having all the swipe buttons for the controls below it? I recently reviewed the Enyaq iV, Skoda's new electric car, and that has a swipe button for the volume control, and I quite liked it because it's one swipe button that has one function and you know where it is. You've now got 3 different swipe panels here for left and right temperature control, and in the middle you've got your volume. But without looking at them, you don't really know which one you're going to reach for until you've already pressed it. Then you need to look at the screen to see what it is that you're doing, and the screen itself is absolutely infuriating. Really very difficult to use, totally unintuitive, and just not very decent. You've still got cheap, scratchy plastics in here, and if you want leather, like this car has, you're going to pay an extra £2,500 for it. You'll also pay extra for the fairly small sunroof, which is a nice thing to have. You'll also pay extra for the dynamic chassis control. That absolute essential, they still won't give you as standard. Bearing in mind this car's 35 grand basic price, that just seems stingy. This car has committed a cardinal sin. It has confused luxury with gimmicks. Nothing about that interior feels particularly upmarket to me. It would have cost so very little to just add a little bit more leather or Alcantara to things, make some of the switches feel that little bit more robust, but instead they've just thrown screens at it. And that's a shame, because on the outside, I really like this car. You can't get it in 3-door variant anymore, but that's fine because no one really bought those anyway. And evolution rather than revolution, I think, should be the Golf way. But at this price, for this little performance, I'm already struggling to think why you would bother buying a GTI at all. Now, I'm sure there will be some already screaming at me saying, but James, you can get a more powerful GTI. That's true. They've already introduced a Club Sport and a Club Sport Special Edition and the R. There's no real thought to this lineup. Normally, you'd get a little bit more time between these models. There'd be a structured release. You know, surely you should do the GTI first, then the R, maybe then the Club Sport for the real driver-focused people. But no, they've just chucked the whole lot out there and said to the world, there you go, buy what you want. And I gotta be honest, if I was looking at buying a hatchback right about now, I can't think of any reason why I would even bother getting into one of these. But I suppose, as I'm here now, I really should try and find out if it's actually that good to drive. And it needs to be, doesn't it? Luckily, initial frustrations aside, there are an awful lot of very core things VW have absolutely nailed with the new Golf. The driving position is absolutely spot on, with the wheel, the seat and the pedals all precisely where I want them to be. Perhaps no surprise, because it's that element of relationship between those things which is really core to the MQB platform that underpins this and many other VAG products. The engine also, whilst not exactly exciting, is dutiful. It spins up very quickly, it's torquey, it's got a good spread of power, up to about 6,500 RPM. The DSG gearbox has resisted the temptation to grow a whole bevy of gears, so you've only got the 7 still, but they work really nicely. They're well spaced, it's smooth, snappy when you want it to be, and around town it works reasonably well, although not quite as good as a torque converter. I'm also very happy to say that the car itself hasn't really grown over the years much either. Many of its rivals have become almost a parody of themselves, but the Golf has remained perfectly sensible in its proportions. In fact, it's only millimeters larger than even the old Mark V, and that means you've got just enough space for 4 adults in here, reasonable amount in the boot for your shopping. You can place the car on the road with ease, parking is not a problem, and it is an ideal everyday car. There are also certain things that may appear to be gimmicks on the face of it, but actually work really well. Like, for example, the dynamic chassis control now has a slider for you to customize it when you're using the individual mode, rather than simply comfort or sport settings. And that means you can set it either more comfortable than comfort or sportier than sport. It really does make a pronounced difference, with the super comfy mode actually being somewhat plush for a hot hatch, and the sporty mode being unbearably stiff. Even VW say really that's for using on the track. On a road like this, which is where a hot hatch should really shine, the Golf certainly does. You have a mechanical limited slip differential up front. Although 245 horsepower isn't really going to impress anyone, it's certainly enough to get you down the road with a bit of enthusiasm. Gearbox really excellent in its response. The engine has very little turbo lag, especially once you've got beyond about 3,000 RPM, and the steering, whilst not brimming with texture and feedback, has a nice reassuring weighting to it, and it's pretty direct. I must confess I also do quite like the VW Digital Dash. It's a very different take to the Audi and even the Volvo I've also got on test at the moment, and I'd say compared to the Swede, this does things a lot better. There are loads of different ways you can have this laid out, and actually it does present you with some really useful information. Other things you may consider useful information would be the fuel economy, and here the Golf does pretty much exactly the same as every other modern car that I seem to test. About 30 odd to the gallon seems to be the average for this car. The more I drive this car, the more I find things that I both love and don't love about it. I love the wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which also interact properly with the car, meaning that you get sat-nav instructions fed from Google Maps to your display, or if you need it, your heads up. And that's fantastic. It's the first time I've actually experienced that in a car, and it makes a big difference. The engine doesn't sound very good, but it's also quite loud. I have played around with a lot of the different modes and things, but even in comfort, it still seems to be quite boomy at low RPM. Whether there is a sound actor or something like that in here, I don't know, but it's just an unpleasant noise I don't really want to hear, especially when I'm just driving around town. It's very unnecessary, really. I really do like these seats. I've never really been a fan, I'll confess, of the classic tartan look in a Golf GTI. It's just not me. It's very comfortable, supportive, great for when you're pressing on or just on a long journey. However, it is very disappointing that only the driver's seat is electric. On the plus side though, you do get both heating and cooling in the front seats, and that really isn't something you'd expect to find in this kind of car. There are other touches too in the car I really appreciate. The visibility is excellent. You've even got this tiny little window here, which doesn't really do that much, but gives you just that a little bit extra. You can just see the pavement, everything else, just a little bit better than you can normally. And that is useful, I appreciate that. I also absolutely love the rear view camera on these. It shouldn't be an optional extra, but at £300, I think it's well worth it because it's a pretty clever little device. It hides under the VW logo, and that means that when you want to reverse with this car, you've always got a decent, clean picture to see. Why all manufacturers don't do that, I'm not sure, but I think it's a genius piece of engineering that's the kind of thing we should be seeing from the Golf. None of this mock iPad nonsense, wave at the car to get it to start, whisper in its ear if you want to change track on your iPod. No. Good, honest, sensible engineering. That's what the Golf should be all about. However, the GTI is also about having a lot of fun. So can you still do that? And today, as you can probably tell, it's a little bit damp. I've had this car for a whole week, and this is about the closest to dry it's actually going to be. Very frustrating considering it's May at the time of filming. But what this does mean is that the extra power of, say, a Civic Type R would simply be lost, because I know that would just want to spin its wheels on a day like today. Let's set the car into sport mode, shall we? Which you have to look over here to see the button, then press a screen. All very unnecessary, but hey-ho. It's a good turn of pace, this car. It's no slouch, but once you have experienced things like the Civic Type R, this feels just woefully under-equipped. Now, admittedly, the Mk8 Golf has already been out for, well, nearly a couple of years, but in that time we've already seen the release of the GTI, the GTE, the GTD, the GTI Club Sport with 300 horsepower, the GTI Club Sport 45th edition, and the R. I also did check the finance figures to see whether there was the same lack of difference in pricing on this car as there was with the old Mark 7, but no, VW have put a little bit of air between them. In terms of regular RRP, you're still looking at a good sort of, well, 4 to 5 grand, if not a bit more, for a GTI versus an R. And on your monthlies, you're looking at probably another £80 down. On a base GTI, the figures VW provided were about £3,500 down, 10% as your deposit, and £400 a month. Now, £400 a month seems like a much more reasonable figure for this car. 42.5 grand, I just couldn't stomach. And indeed, if this particular vehicle were 35 grand as tested, I think I'd be able to make much more of a case for it. It's up to you really to decide whether you like the technobabble interior. I really don't, and I will keep banging on about it because as far as I'm concerned, any basic commonly accessed feature which you have to use a touch screen to enable or disable is dumb and dangerous. Even basic things like disabling the auto start stop. Most people, including VW in the past, have just given you a button because we know everybody wants to turn it off. And indeed, this particular car, very keen on the old auto start stop. It doesn't give you any time at all. You're coming towards some traffic lights, you're slowing down, and it feels like the engine's off before you've actually even come to a halt. That means it's not always the smoothest thing around town. But if you want to disable it, you've got to pull down this menu from the top, then press auto start stop off. Very impressed with the response of this thing. It really is a good engine. I know it's only an evolution of what came before, but honestly, that bit of the car was always okay. Oh, you even get, that was even on the downshift there. I may be going mad, but that was just a little crackle, just a little bit of something coming out, was it? The ride quality is really good. There's always a little bit of bounce to it, even when you've got it in its comfy mode. I'm going to go to my individual setting now, which, like most people, has essentially everything in sport except the steering, which I've got in comfort. And in fact, the steering I'm going to put into sport. Don't mind a little bit of extra weight. And I'm going to put the suspension to the comfort setting. Everything else, so you've got engine sound. So evidently there must be, I'm gonna leave the engine sound in sport for now. You've got automatic cruise control, light assistance. Why is that? I don't know. And why is it sport? How can you have sporty lights? They have clearly spent so much time on this infotainment making it look pretty, because every screen has its own little graphic on it. It's absolutely flipping ridiculous, honestly. Honestly, I think this is probably one of the most exciting Golf GTIs I've driven in a very long time, excluding the absolutely bananas Club Sport S. As a regular hot hatch, this thing is very good indeed. No, it doesn't have the precision, the firepower, or just the absolutely ridiculous pace of the Civic Type R, but it seems a little bit more comfortable than that car too. The way it drives more or less matches the way that it looks, i.e. this is a bit more sedate than the Civic, but it's got no issue in terms of pace. On a day like today, where you've got really mixed conditions, you'll be able to go as fast in this as you can in pretty much anything. I'm really delighted to see that VW have also fitted a proper mechanical limited slip diff to this car. There is an element of torque steer, particularly in the first 2 or 3 gears, but it's never really problematic, certainly nowhere near, say, the old Fords I've driven recently. Engine is absolutely fantastic. No, it hasn't got the power, but it's got the response, which is what I need. The gearbox partners with it really well. I know people love their manuals, and indeed, if you want a manual, get one. Fabulous things. But I actually do like the DSG box. The car's not so ludicrously capable you can't have fun in it, and you do actually feel like you're really connected to it. The steering's got a genuine sense of weighting to it. I don't feel like I'm playing a video game here. This is a really nice thing to drive. And that's just as well, because I'm struggling with the Golf GTI. I really, really am. Like I said, looks approved. Interior space, no problem whatsoever. Exterior and interior dimensions, absolutely spot on. The driving experience, very pleasant indeed. Engine, gearbox, steering, brakes, the whole lot, they're all very good, perfectly weighted, they respond nicely, everything works really well. You can tell it's all been honed and refined until it's pitch perfect. But you then chuck all this nonsense at it, all these screens and gimmicks and things that it doesn't need. And, not to put too fine a point on it, this doesn't really feel any more classy or upmarket than the old Golf. Same typical VW materials. I drove the Arteon recently, and that definitely did feel a bit of a step up. This doesn't. It just feels the same as it always did. And at £42,500 as tested, it's a difficult one. Not only because that's a huge amount of money to justify on any car, but because there isn't really an awful lot that will directly compare with it. Because most of your hot hatches, say your i30N, your Civic Type Rs, they're going to come in quite a bit cheaper. Or you've then got your hyper hatches, your RS3s of the world, A45S, that sort of stuff. Well, they're all quite a bit more money. So this winds up sitting awkwardly in the middle. The one I'd really like to try is the GTI Club Sport 45th, because that has some nice features about it and looks as close as we may get to a successor to the old Club Sport S, only with back seats and a bit more practicality, that kind of stuff. Turning circle is very good. Took the car shopping earlier, it does wonderfully. This has the IQ light system on it, although in truth I haven't actually driven it at night yet to know whether they're any good. On the Arteon, they were frustrating. They never really quite worked as well as many other systems that I've used, and I would hazard a guess this is probably the same. I like the sunroof, that's nice. Again, why? Why is it a... Whatever was wrong with a button for that? I just want it to open up. That's what I want. I want a bit of air. There we for the... You press the button in different places. It seems to do different things. That's stupid. Who sat there? Who in Germany? This is the sort of thing I'd expect from an Italian. Oh, to open the sunroof, you've got to draw your name on it. Like, no. To have this from the Germans, right? I'm going to stop. This is how ridiculous this car has got. I have to stop now and look. Yeah. Oh, so it was. So you press it in the middle and it'll open up. Oh. If you want a sensible, enjoyable hatchback with a bit of poke that does the daily thing and the weekend thing equally well, I'd say the Golf GTI is a good contender. Only if you get it with a fairly healthy discount, because it just isn't worth 42.5 grand. Sorry. And I want all the things this car has. I want my heads-up display. I want the dynamic chassis control. I want my sunroof. I want my leather seats. These are not frivolous items. These are all things that I want in this car. And at 35 grand, I'd expect to be standard. The Golf's always been a bit like that. It's always been very Germanic in that they give you next to nothing as standard. But every time they put that price up, it becomes just a little bit harder to justify the way that they do business. To put this into some context, you could go and buy yourself a Kia Stinger, a car that exists in a class probably about 2 or 3 above this, and that would give you your heated and cooled seats in the front, heated in the back, your panoramic sunroof, your Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, although not wireless, plus a 3.3 litre twin turbo V6 engine with 370 horsepower, plenty of leather and stuff inside, a banging sound system, all of that jazz for the same price as this. And they'll chuck in a 7-year warranty, and that's all without haggling as well. In truth, it would really worry me if anybody actually used my review and my review exclusively to make their decision about their next purchase. I really hope that anybody would only ever use YouTube as a sort of guide, get an idea of roughly whether a car is worth investigating further or not. And the bit about this, I suppose, you'll never be able to tell from the press release is just how well it drives, and I'm very happy to say that it drives really quite well. But for the money, that alone, to me, cannot save this car. If you really like your Golfs, and you'd have to like your Golfs, do give it a look. But if anything, you'd probably wind up just either spending a lot more money and getting an R or a Club Sport, or spending a lot less and going and buying a Focus ST or a Fiesta ST. Yes, it's in a different class, I know, but they're a popular car for a reason. As a car and a brand that's often been associated with youth, I think the Golf GTI is pretty much dead now, because what young person can afford to spend this much money on this kind of car? I don't know any of them. Anyway, that's my little take on the Golf GTI Mark 8. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.